Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to do a little bit of a review of basically the type of things we'd want to be really comfortable with going into exam one. Now, I'm going to cover these topics here, and it's not going to be a perfectly exhaustive review. That's not at all the goal. The goal is that this is going to be a review going over the highlights that, hopefully you've been putting in the work throughout the term to this point to be pretty comfortable with, and now I want to kind of go back over and review. All right, so the idea here is to cover basic core principles. We have four core principles: demand, supply, right? We have individual demand, we have market demand, we have individual supply, we have market supply, we have equilibrium, so let's bring demand and supply together, and then we have elasticity. And of course, we're following the Stevenson-Wolfers text that we've been using this term. All right, so the basic idea is we are trying to build a framework around these four core principles, around the cost-benefit principle, opportunity cost principle, marginal principle, and interdependence principle. So firstly, you should be comfortable with each of these four. You should know what each of these are and how and where they're used. And then the other thing that's really important is to pay attention to where these core principles are showing back up when we cover demand, when we cover supply, and then henceforth through the course. Because the whole point of being really deliberate of introducing these four core principles is that this gives us our foundation for everything that we do in the future, and not just in the usual sort of sense of saying, oh, well, course is cumulative, things that happened during chapter one show up in the future. No, like we want to be really deliberate about bringing back the cost benefit principle, opportunity cost principle, marginal principle, especially through the rational rule. We'll have a rational rule for buyers, for sellers, for employers, for society, right? And then a couple other places. And the important thing that you want to be able to do going forward is be really deliberate about observing where these principles are being used in the future. And that's really important for your overarching understanding. All right, so the cost-benefit principle is basically reminding us we have to consider the full set of costs and the full set of benefits when we're making our decision. So we want to think about all the relevant costs, all the relevant benefits. We want to ignore the irrelevant costs, such as sunk costs. And then ultimately, what do we want to do? Well, we want to pursue those, you consider these different choices and pursue those choices whose benefits are at least as large as their costs. You can see just as this is phrased here, this gives sort of a natural lead into how we frame the rational rule, right? We for a decision we can incrementalize, we break it down into a choice of should we do one more. So that's the application of the marginal principle, and then after having applied the marginal principle, we compare marginal benefit to marginal cost. That's an application of the cost benefit principle. But anyway, that's kind of how they fit together. And actually, that's a really important distinction, being able to distinguish between what's the cost benefit principle and what's the marginal principle. Once again, so before I get too far ahead of myself, cost benefit principle is literally where you're comparing cost to benefits. The marginal principle is breaking down the decision to considering the contribution of one more. So it's breaking down a how much decision, how many decision to a one more decision. That's the marginal principle. And then the literal comparison of marginal benefit to marginal cost is an application of the cost benefit principle. All right, so then we have the opportunity cost principle. I say you should think of opportunity cost as your sacrifice. You want to think about you could do one thing or what else. So what is the other thing that you are foregoing when you make one choice instead of the alternative, right? This is reminding us the true cost of something is the next best alternative that you have to give up in order to get it. That's why I say you always want to think of opportunity costs as sacrifice. It's a little bit misleading to see opportunity, like you feel like this is something you get. No, this is something you get to give up, right? That's the idea with the opportunity cost, is it's a sacrifice. It's not something out there that you're getting to experience. No, this is something that you're not getting to experience. That's the point. And then we want our decisions to optimally reflect this opportunity cost rather than just the explicit cash outlays. So obviously we'll pay attention to financial costs, but we also want to pay attention to the sacrifice that's involved with doing one thing instead of another. This is really important, like especially if you're considering buying one thing instead of another, right? So maybe you save your money and you're going to choose between two different vehicles. You could buy one or the other car, and they're other thing equal about the same price, probably get about the same value from one or the other. Maybe you have a slight brand preference or whatever. And even though you saved for it, you budgeted for it, you can afford either car, by virtue of having bought the first, you give up the ability to buy the second, right? And now you're stuck, so to speak, with the one that you've bought. You give up, you forego the ability to experience having whatever would have been the other car. It doesn't even have to be something as big as a car. It could be like whatever you're having for breakfast, right? And by virtue of whatever you've chosen for breakfast, you give up the ability to have something else, right? And so the idea is like, especially in the situation where you can only do one thing, you're definitely not only giving up something, you're losing, you're sacrificing, but it's maybe a little bit more salient in those situations because you've literally occupied, think of like pigeonhole principle, you've like literally occupied whatever is that capacity to experience something with something else. So anyway, there is this graph from the slides and then from the text, and I want to call attention to a couple things here. So remember, we had this character was choosing whether to pursue an MBA or to continue working full time. So we had listed the costs of the choice associated with pursuing the MBA. Then we listed the cost of the next best alternative if continues to work full-time instead. Now notice this has been framed, the way that we framed this is we're identifying the opportunity cost of pursuing the MBA, right? The perspective is the opportunity cost of pursuing the MBA is what we're trying to count out here. Now you could have frame the perspective the other way. You could think of if the opportunity cost of pursuing the MBA is the foregone ability to work, the opportunity cost of working is the foregone ability to pursue the MBA, right? Well, anyway, so here we're taking the perspective that the choice is whether or not to pursue the MBA. So we want to think of what are the costs of the choice? Well, there's tuition, there's giving up the job, there's room and board, and then there's 10 hours per day studying. And we want to think of, okay, well, if they don't do the MBA, what are their other options? Well, their next best option is continuing to work full time. Well, they won't have to pay tuition. They would earn $70,000 from their job. Rent and meals would cost $24,000. Oh, wait a second. That's the same as over here. And 10 hours per day at work. So this is relevant because we're recognizing that between these two alternatives, there is no additional cost going relative to like food and living accommodations, right? There's no opportunity cost they have to pay for housing and food, whether or not they pursue an MBA, right? And the same thing for studying and for hours at work. They work 10 hours per day either way. Now, there could be an additional opportunity cost if one of these numbers were different, right? So if it was the case that the reason why there's no additional opportunity cost is because they exactly balance out. If it was the case that one or the other was different, there might be an additional cost or an additional benefit of doing one or the other thing. And indeed, that's what's happening up here. So pursuing an MBA costs $60,000 in tuition. The next best alternative is not paying tuition. And so the opportunity cost is the foregone money. The $60,000 in tuition is an opportunity cost of pursuing the MBA because that money could have been spent on something else, right? This money could have been spent on down payment for a house or a really nice car or investing or whatever. And then in terms of like the other costs of the choice, well, if they pursue the MBA, they give up the ability to work this job. And this involves $70,000 in foregone income, right? So one of the costs of the MBA is losing the ability to earn this income. Overall, this is a net loss or net opportunity cost of $130,000 per year. There is the literal cash outlay of $60,000, and there is the loss of the $70,000 that's given up. And so that's where the $130,000 is coming from. Okay, so anyway, so you want to think carefully about identifying what are the costs of the different alternatives and then paying attention to what's incurred one way and what's incurred only the other, or what's incurred both ways, what's incurred only one way or the other. All right, so the marginal principle. Marginal principle is where we're incrementalizing decisions. So we're breaking down a decision into choice of, well, ought you pursue one more, right? So the idea is you're literally breaking down how many decisions into a series of smaller decisions, and you keep asking the question, do I do one more, right? So for instance, using the marginal principle, you might consider how much to buy. So you'd break this down into the choice of, ought I buy one more? Having broken this down into the marginal incremental decision, now you are going to apply the cost-benefit principle and compare what's the marginal benefit, what's the benefit of that one more increment and versus the cost. And if the benefit is bigger than the cost, well, then you do it and then you buy one more and then you iterate, asking yourself again. And you keep doing this, you'd continue until the situation where the cost is actually bigger than the benefit, and then you'd stop, right? And so this actually gives rise to our rational rule, which is continue doing whatever is the activity as long as the benefit is at least as big as the cost. What happens if the benefit is exactly equal to the cost? What happens if the marginal benefit exactly equals marginal cost? Well, then you're optimizing, right? That's the optimal outcome, right? That's where marginal benefit equals marginal cost is where you'd have reached whatever is the maximum that you're able to attain. All right, so the marginal principle gives us this guide that helps us maximize surplus, right? The rational rule says if something's worth doing, keep doing until the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. That's where you're optimizing. And indeed, we've got a rational rule for everything. We've got a rational rule for buyers. We've got a rational rule for sellers, for employers, for employees, for society. There's a wide variety of rational rules, and it's basically just breaking down the incremental decision into comparing marginal benefit versus marginal cost. But the basic idea is if you follow the rational rule, this gives us good decisions, and it actually maximizes economic surplus. If we're talking about from the perspective of a firm, it would maximize profits. All right, and then the last one is the interdependence principle. This is just basically the realization that choices are dependent on a lot of other things and affect a lot of other things. So your best choice depends on your other choices made by others, developments in other markets, expectations about the future. And if any of these change, your own best choice will change. We use the interdependence principle, especially when we're talking about demand and supply, when something other than the price of the good changes. That's where we invoke the interdependence principle. All right, so I want to talk about demand, in particular the individual demand curve. So the individual demand curve is unique to a specific buyer. It's going to collect all the possible combinations of price and quantities demanded. The basic idea is at a given price, the person's individual demand curve tells us how much they would want to buy. And at a different price, they'd want to buy a different amount. We're assuming that this will obey the law of demand. At higher prices, they want to buy less, and at lower prices, they want to buy more. So the basic idea is the individual demand curve then gives rise to this graph. It plots the quantity of the item that somebody wants to buy at every price. And it shows whatever is the reflection we might face as a buyer. At this price, what's the quantity I ought to buy? And the important detail for the individual demand curve, and actually for an ordinary demand curve, the market demand curve, is that it is holding other things constant. So we're holding constant anything else that could think about changing your plans, and we're looking at just at a different price, what's the quantity, right? And that's what we're doing with the individual demand curve. Now, if some of these other things that we're holding constant are no longer held constant, all of a sudden we're on a different individual demand curve, right? All right, another important observation is the vertical height of the demand curve associated with any quantity is the marginal benefit. That's going to correspond on the vertical axis with a price, right? So the demand curve is also the marginal benefit curve. In the text, it says the theory of demand is the theory of marginal benefit. So on our graph, there's a price equals marginal benefit relationship, and the basic idea is just what I was saying before. The vertical height at any quantity is the marginal benefit. It's the willingness to pay. It's the maximum it's the maximum that unit would sell for. And then looking over at the vertical axis, you have the associated price. The demand curve illustrates the price at which you're willing to buy each quantity. Right? It's giving you your maximal willingness to pay. So there's more on this relationship. The demand curve is the marginal benefit curve in the text and in the slides. I've got a video. It's called something like All About Demand. I started off by making a comment about wearing black and brown together, which I love to do and lots of people don't like, so that you'd know you found the right video if you look at that one. And anyway, I kind of go into detail about breaking down the graphical components of the demand curve, but if I remember, I'll link it. Anyway, so then market demand. The market demand curve is a graph plotting the total quantity of the item demanded. by the entire market at each associated price. So the only thing is relative to the individual demand. Now we're extending this to all market participants. So for a given price, what's the quantity? Oh, it's not just the quantity from one person, it's the quantity from everyone in the market. So that's the difference. It's the sum of the quantity demanded by each person, right? Well, at a specific price, the quantity that we see is the sum of the quantity demanded by each person. And ultimately, the individual demand curves are the building blocks for the market demand. We're aggregating up everybody's individual demand to get the overarching demand curve. All right, so we have the law of demand. The market demand curve obeys the law of demand. Total quantity is higher when the price is lower. Other things held constant, right? So if something else changes, then we got a shift to the demand curve. We're on actually a different demand curve entirely, and then you might get some weird things happening if you're expecting the law of demand. As a matter of fact, like if you were to pick 2 points on different demand curves, you're more likely than not going to end up with a situation that would have, if you're not paying attention, would look like it violates the law of demand. I mean, think about it. If you got particular price and associated quantity, and then you shift the demand curve, then at that same quantity, now the price is going to be higher, right? And so so you'd have some really weird things going on if you didn't recognize that the 2 points you were looking at are on very different demand curves. So anyway, price changes quantity demanded for both new and old customers. And then when prices are low, current customers buy more. In this case, the example was gas. That's the intensive margin. When prices are low, the number of customers increases. That's the extensive margin. So this is sort of reinforcing what's happening with the law of demand. So the idea is when the price changes, only quantity can change. So the price changes, quantity demanded changes, and the quantity demanded changes for actually those already in the market as well as those prospective customers who haven't bought yet, in the case of if the price is dropping. So we distinguish between the intensive and the extensive margin. I think of the intensive margin as those who are currently in this transactional relationship do it with greater intensity, and the extensive margin being those who are not presently in this relationship we end up extending market activity to bring them in, or in the case of shrinking the market activity to leave them out. So the point is, when the price falls, the existing consumers will buy more, and there's new consumers that are going to join the market. There's kind of 2 stories for that. One is, if you're thinking about the vertical height of the demand curve as the marginal benefit or the maximal willingness to pay for customers associated with a particular quantity, and now the price falls, the price has fallen below what would have been my maximal willingness to pay. Now I probably am going to buy more. And then also we're tracing down a demand curve to people with lower willingness to pay who ordinarily wouldn't have been purchasing, but after the price decrease, then join the market. So the latter would be the extensive margin, the former was the intensive margin. Again, when prices change, only quantity can change, right? That's a movement along the demand curve. It's a movement from one point on the demand curve to another point on the same curve, and it's caused by a price change and a price change only. We call this a change in quantity demanded, right? So when price changes, we get a change in quantity demanded, or if we're talking about the supply curve, a change in quantity supplied. But when prices change, we get a change in quantity demanded represented by moving up or down the original demand curve. When something other than price changes, now demand can change. And when I'm talking about price here, look, I mean the price of the good under consideration, because you'll notice amongst our demand shifters, we have the price of related goods, right? So if there's a price change for some other good that's closely related by the interdependence principle, it matters, right? So you want to ask yourself a question: is the related good a complement or a substitute? So if price changes and it's the good we're talking about, then only quantity can change. But if price changes and it's some other good that's not the good we're talking about, you want to determine how are they related, how are they linked? Are they complements or are they substitutes? If income changes, you want to ask the further question: is the good normal or inferior? If a good is normal and income rises, you'll buy more. If the good is inferior and income rises, you'll buy less, right? So demand shifts to the right for an income increase for a normal good. Demand shifts to the left for an income increase for an inferior good. For the price of related goods, if the price of a complement rises, demand shifts to the left for the good under consideration. If the price of a substitute rises, demand shifts to the right for the good under consideration. Change in preferences just tilt us towards more or less consumption of the good. So a rightward or leftward shift according to whether it's a positive or a negative change. Expectations, so you might expect the future price to change. So that's going to increase demand today, right? If we expect the future price to be higher, that increases demand today. If we expect the future price to be lower, that decreases demand today. We'll just buy in the future instead. Congestion effects, this is where as there's more people consuming this particular product, your valuation for it falls. And then network effects is if there's more people consuming that product, your valuation for it rises. Now, there's some factors that shift only the market demand curve, and this would be like the type and number of buyers. Well, wait a second here. These are shifting both the individual and the market demand curve. This is the one that only shifts the market demand curve. But that should make sense because the market demand curve is comprised of each individual buyer's demand curves, and the individual demand curve only concerns one person's demand curve, right? So of course, the number and type of buyers isn't going to shift the individual demand curve. All right, so individual supply curve. The supply curve, it's a relationship just like our demand relationship where it collects the prices and the quantity supplied at each and every price. You can show this graphically, and the basic idea is it'll show us how much the firm wants to bring to market at a given price. Basically, it's a summary of that firm's plans. And again, the supply curve is holding other things constant. It's making the assumption that nothing else has changed. Basically, this gives rise to the law of supply, which gives us an upward sloping supply curve, which holds in most cases. When we draw supply and demand diagrams, we almost exclusively draw upward sloping supply curves. You can think of some situations we might draw nearly horizontal supply curves, but there's like one question, and I think it's like, well, it's on the practice. It's the Truffles question where I ask for a given percentage change. If you have a horizontal demand curve and a vertical supply curve, which is going to give us the largest increase in the consumption of that good, truffles, a 10% increase in supply, 10% increase in demand, so all these different things. And so that would be like one situation if we're talking about like relatively elastic demand or relatively elastic supply. We might get something other than like the perfect upward sloping supply curve. The other situation where you might get something like a supply curve that's like horizontal is when we get to market structures. We draw like the cost curves for a monopoly or for a competitive market, but especially for a monopoly. Might very often represent their cost relationship just with a marginal cost curve. Remember, the theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost, so it's capturing the same information. Sometimes we'd have constant marginal cost. There'd be a horizontal line. So anyway, the law of supply holds generally, and for our purposes, we typically think, yeah, this is right. And for all practical purposes, like for exam 1, you want to think of supply curves as being upward sloping. But unlike the law of demand, where you pretty much would never get anything other than a downward sloping demand curve, except for some kind of relatively weird, rare stuff, with the supply curve, once we get into the future, you can get some different things going on. Although, now as I'm saying that, you could get a horizontal demand curve, right? You could get a demand curve that's flat. Where does that happen? That's the demand faced by an individual firm in a perfectly competitive market. So anyway. All right. So this upward sloping supply curve is the law of supply. It's the basic idea that at higher prices, there's a higher quantity supplied. So I mentioned perfect competition. Here's where we think about perfect competition. So the basic idea is when we're using the supply and demand diagram, we're invoking perfect competition. It actually turns out it's a little bit inappropriate to use the supply and demand diagram for something other than perfect competition. Like if you use the supply and demand diagram for iPhones, that's not a perfectly competitive market. It's a little bit inappropriate to use it. That said, the general intuition that we get from the supply and demand diagram is sound. And I think as long as everybody kind of understands there's a little bit of an abuse of the model to try to model iPhones with a supply and demand diagram, because it's not a perfectly competitive market, I think it's close enough where you can actually get some pretty good insights from it. That said, like when we do draw the supply and demand diagram, we are implicitly invoking the idea of perfect competition. Basically, that we have firms that are price takers. They're taking the price as given, meaning that they can't change the market price. They just have to choose their quantity given that price. The basic idea is the firms are price takers. They charge the market price, not change, charge. They charge exactly the market price. That's the price that they're able to charge. If they charge anything else, they're worse off. Price takers' actions do not affect the market price. They just take it as given. They're a price taker. Why is your supply curve also your marginal cost curve? I said this earlier. This is in the text. The theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost. The theory of marginal cost is the theory of supply. Basic idea is if you're trying to maximize profit, as firms are assumed to do, you'll keep selling until price equals marginal cost, in this case in a competitive market. So the supply curve, therefore, shows us the quantity sold at every price, right? Supply curve is giving us the quantity sold at every price, right? That's from our supply relationship. At a price, there's the quantity supplied. That's the amount sellers are bringing to the market. And sure enough, they're going to sell until price equals marginal cost. And so, yeah, the supply curve is showing us the quantity sold at every price, which is equivalent to the marginal cost at that point. Right? Okay, so marginal cost includes variable costs, but does not include fixed costs. So now we have a distinction between fixed costs and variable costs. So fixed costs and variable costs are important later on as we're talking about the short run and long run. In the short run, at least one cost is fixed. In the long run, all costs are variable. Variable costs are those costs that vary with the output, like labor and raw materials. This is like ingredients. So if you have a cookie factory, your ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, whatever, are going to be the variable costs. If you make more cookies, you're going to use more ingredients, so you're going to incur higher variable costs. Fixed costs don't vary when the quantity of output changes. They're incurred regardless of the level of output. So in my cookie factory example, this would be like the cost of capital, the factory, the ovens, and maybe like your delivery trucks or whatever, things that you're going to have and you're going to have paid for, whether you make one batch of cookies or a million. All right. The market supply curve is going to aggregate up all the individual supply curves. Right? The market supply is a graph plotting the total quantity of the item supplied by the entire market at each price. It's the sum of the quantity supplied by each individual seller, just like our market demand was the sum of individual demand curves. When prices change, only quantity can change. If we're talking about the supply relationship, then if price changes, only quantity supplied can change. So this gives us, just like with demand, change in price on the supply curve gives us a movement along the supply curve to a change in quantity supplied, right? The change in quantity associated with the movement along a fixed supply curve is our change in quantity supplied. Now, if something other than price changes, now supply can change, right? So this would be things like input prices, so the price of ingredients for my cookie factory. Productivity and technology. I don't know, maybe I've got my oven bakes quicker for my cookies than it previously did, or whatever. Prices of related outputs. Well, does the firm make additional substitutes or complements? Maybe my cookie batter could be used for cookie dough ice cream or something like that. So think about that, be a substitute. Well, if there's leftover, or it could be it could be a complement if I'm using leftover scraps of my cookie dough that didn't make it into cookies. So anyway, and then expectations. Do I think the price is going to rise or fall in the future? Right, so these are things that would shift the individual and market supply curves. Basically, so you should recognize all of these, and you should be able to recognize all the demand shifters. That'll make taking the exam a lot easier, because if you see one of these things, you'll recognize and you'll know kind of what they do. But the low-cost way to approach this is basically identify what's changing. If it's price, then only quantity can change. If it's not price, then demand or supply can change, and then you only have to identify is this a demand side or a supply side change. All right. The following shifts only the market supply curve, the type and number of sellers, right? All right. Lastly, for supply and demand, we bring together to equilibrium. Now, the way that actually we want to think about this is we introduce the core principles. We talked about demand, we talk about supply, we bring it together for equilibrium, and then we're interested in changes, right? We're interested in if there's something other than price changes, so demand or supply shifts, what's going to be the outcome for equilibrium? So if something other than price changes, that gives us a shift of demand or supply, and we want to identify how is the market price and market quantity going to be affected in equilibrium. Now, if price changes, right, now we're moving along a single demand or supply curve, then that's what elasticity is going to help us understand, is the magnitude of that change, right? So after introducing demand and supply together, then we start talking about like comparative statics, changes in demand and supply and their impacts on equilibrium, and then elasticity, changes in price or income or prices of related goods. All right, so markets organize economic activity. Markets determine what gets produced, how much gets produced, who produces it, who receives it, and at what price. They bring potential buyers into contact with potential sellers, and market outcomes are determined by forces of supply and demand. Basically, we think really broadly about markets. It's basically where buyers and sellers are coming together for exchange. So there can be all different types of markets. There can be formal markets, informal markets, markets with prices, markets with no prices. Basically, as long as there's economic activity and as long as buyers and sellers are coming together in a decentralized fashion, you've got the foundations for a market. The market equilibrium specifically involves a price where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. It's where the amount that sellers want to sell is exactly the amount that buyers want to buy. So then we have equilibrium. We have our equilibrium quantity, and we have our equilibrium price. It's specifically the price that makes that happen. The equilibrium quantity, well, that's the quantity where quantity demanded and quantity supplied is equal at equilibrium. And in equilibrium, suppliers and demanders both have no reason to change their behavior, to buy more or buy less, or bring more to market or bring less to market. Right? Now, if the price is too high or too low, meaning if the price is above the natural market equilibrium, or if the price is below the natural equilibrium, now we've got a problem. So if the price is above the equilibrium, now the quantity supplied will exceed the quantity demanded, and we've got a surplus. Now, this is different than economic surplus. Economic surplus is the difference between the willingness to pay of buyers and the cost of sellers. It's like the value that's created. This surplus is in the sense of, right here, is in the sense of extra. It's if quantity supplied is bigger than quantity demanded, sellers have brought more to the market than buyers want to buy, so we've got extra, we've got surplus. When price is below the equilibrium price, quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. Now we've got a shortage, right? Buyers want to buy more than is available, so that's a shortage. All right, so the next thing we want to be able to do, and I won't go into huge detail here, but this is something you want to kind of work through with graphs and with the practice exercises and from the text. You want to think about predicting what happens in response to changes, right? So we want to be able to identify the consequences of shifts in demand and supply, specifically on price and on quantity, right? And the other thing you want to do is if you see a change in price, if you see a change in quantity, try to look back and identify whether demand or supply changed, right? So you can get a kind of a sense of this even without the graph. The way that I like to do this, so definitely you should have paper and pencil with you. You should plan on writing out graphs, or however is the case. You should always draw. If you can draw the right graph, it'll give you the right answer. So that's important. But you can get a lot of intuition just from thinking about demand and supply in terms of what's happening. So if you have an increase in demand, I like thinking about buyers kind of competing with each other. And if buyers are competing with each other, it's going to be a larger quantity sold, and they're going to compete up the price. If there's a decrease in demand, now you've got buyers losing interest. If buyers lose interest, there's going to be less sold at a smaller price, right? So if demand shifts to the right, you're going to get price and quantity rising. Demand shifts to the left, you're going to get price and quantity falling. And so this is what this means, is if I observe price and quantity have both fallen, then I know regardless of what happened to supply, the strongest effect on the market was a decrease in demand. Or if I see both price and quantity rising, regardless of what happened to supply, I know the dominant effect in the market was an increase in demand. You can also think about supply. So I think of an increase in supply, it's like flooding the market. So there's going to be a larger quantity at a lower price. And I think of a decrease in supply as just like massive scarcity, right? As something becomes increasingly scarce, price goes up and quantity goes down, right? So if I observe quantity going down and price going up, right, regardless of what happened to demand, I know the predominant effect in that market was a leftward shift of supply. Or if I see the quantity going up and the price going down, regardless of what happened with demand, that is akin to flooding the market, to an increase in supply. Right? All right, so you can actually summarize what I just said by this right here. Now, I would recommend thinking about and internalizing the logic I just conveyed when I was talking on the previous slides, like thinking about conceptually what happens when demand and supply shift, or drawing the graph or something like that. You should be aware of these two key rules. You could memorize them. That would be helpful, but I don't know if it's worth, I don't know. So I always like trying to memorize the process rather than the outcome of the process, right? Don't memorize all the possible graphs you could ever encounter. Just memorize how to draw the graphs, right? Okay, so here's two key rules. If prices and quantity move in the same direction, then the demand curve has definitely shifted, right? It's possible supply has also shifted. This is why I said regardless of what happened to supply, if price and quantity both fall, we know that this is a leftward shift of demand. That's like if consumers are losing interest in that good. If prices and quantity move in opposite directions, then the supply curve definitely shifted, right? So if the price falls and quantity rises, this is like flooding the market, right? Now it's possible something else happened to demand, but we know the predominant effect was supply, right? The last thing we want to talk about is elasticity. So elasticity is about responsiveness of the quantity variable to changes in like price, income, prices of related goods, and so on. So a good one to kind of get our bearings with is the price elasticity of demand. So we got a price change, we're going to get a quantity change. We can get some insight from the law of demand, right? At higher prices, quantity demanded will fall, but what elasticity is conveying above and beyond is how much, the degree of responsiveness, right? But by how much? So the price elasticity of demand is a measure of how responsive buyers are to price changes, right? Price elasticity of demand is our percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. It's a fraction. You want to think of it as a fraction. And then think about what's necessary to get a fraction that's a ratio bigger than 1 in absolute value, or a ratio that's smaller than 1 in absolute value, right? For this to be an elasticity of like, well, let me obey the law of demand and sign this negative. If we get an elasticity of -2, think about that. That'd be like a -2 for the numerator and a 1 for the denominator. Oh, that's a smaller change in price and double the change in quantity, right? So that's really responsive demand. Or suppose my elasticity was -1/3, right? This would be think about the 3 in the denominator. That's huge relative to the 1 in the numerator. So it's a big change in price, really small change in quantity. That's inelastic or unresponsive demand. Now, sometimes, even though we know by the law of demand this relationship's always negative, sometimes we report this positive in absolute value, right? Sometimes we report the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand. I don't know. I go back and forth between which one I think is easier or better. I don't know. The important thing is being consistent, and you don't want to say the price elasticity of demand is 2. You want to say in absolute value the price elasticity of demand is 2. Because if you say the price elasticity of demand is 2, that's telling us that you have an upward sloping demand curve. All right, so now we want to think about interpreting the numerical value. I just did this a second ago with my example. I was talking about the numerator and the denominator. If the absolute value of price elasticity is bigger than 1, we know demand is really responsive. It's elastic. The percentage change in quantity is larger, the numerator is larger than the percentage change in price, denominator. The quantity is very responsive to changes in price. The demand curve is relatively flat. If the absolute value of the price elasticity is less than 1, well, now we know demand is inelastic. The percentage change in quantity is smaller than the percent change in price. We've got a larger denominator, a smaller numerator. And now we've got quantity that's relatively unresponsive to changes in price. We got a relatively steep demand curve would do this. All right, so there's a relationship between elasticity and revenue. The basic idea is, well, revenue is just, price times quantity, right? Total revenue is just price times quantity. When we change price, revenue changes through two directions, two channels, right? Increase the price, that tends towards raising revenue. However, when we raise the price, that tends towards decreasing quantity. Now, if price rises by more than quantity falls, we have inelastic demand and revenue will go up. If price rises by less than quantity falls, we have elastic demand and revenue goes down. Right? All right. Then we have some other elasticities. We have the cross-price elasticity. This tells us how goods are related. Gives us the percentage change in quantity demanded following a percentage change in price of some related good. So like for substitutes, it's positive. For complements, it's negative. So think about like if the price of Pepsi goes up, well, we'll get a decrease in quantity demanded of Pepsi, and we've got an increase in Coke. Actually, an increase in demand for Coke, and that'll give us an increase in quantity as well, because increase in demand is the same as saying a higher quantity demanded at each and every price. Okay, so we'd get cross-price elasticity of demand positive for substitutes because they're moving in the same direction. We get a rise in the price of good 2, and we get a rise in the quantity of good 1. Higher price for Pepsi, higher quantity of Coke, right? Because you buy Coke instead. Negative for complements. The price of a printer rises, you buy fewer cartridges. Price of printer rises, I buy less cartridges, so this is negative. Right? Income elasticity tells us how the quantity demanded responds to income changes. So it's positive for a normal good, negative for an inferior good. So income rises, quantity rises, that's a normal good. Income rises, quantity falls, that's an inferior good. You can further delineate between if the elasticity is positive and bigger than 1 or negative and more negative than -1. And in those cases, you'd have relatively elastic, relatively responsive. So if you have really large positive income elasticity, typically think of those goods as luxuries. If you have a positive income elasticity between 0 and 1, we think of those typically as necessities. Relatively unresponsive to income changes. People buy them either way. All right, so price elasticity of supply gives us how responsive sellers are to price changes. So the formula looks just like price elasticity of demand. Matter of fact, the only thing that's different between price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply, especially like through the midpoint formula, is just the sign, right? Because what's happening by the law of supply, when price rises, quantity supplied rises, right? Basic idea is like we're looking to see how responsive sellers are to price changes. So for a given percentage change in price, what happens to the percentage change in quantity supplied? So we already know when price rises, the amount sellers bring to the market is going to rise as well. But does it respond a great deal or only a little? Is it elastic or is it inelastic? Okay, so that brings me to the end of this review here. Next video I'm going to do is going to be, I don't know if I'll remember to link it up here. It's going to be the walkthrough for the practice exam. But anyway, hope you enjoy, and I'll see you next time.